Seaman, Chapter 5, Sioux Territory, August 27th through October 1804. On the 27th of August, as the boats passed the mouth of the James River, an Indian boy swam over to one of the pirogues. Some of the men could speak a few words of the teenager's language, and others knew sign language. Soon enough, the explorers understood the boy was a Yankton Sioux. The captains asked him to bring some of his tribe to a meeting. At last, the Corps of Discovery was about to come face to face with the mighty Sioux. The meeting took place 3 days later on August 30th at the Calumet Bluffs. Again, the men wore their dress uniforms and staged a military display. Again, Captain Lewis gave a speech about the new white father and his plans for trade with the Indians. The captains passed out medals and small presents to the Yankton chiefs. The Indians dressed up for the occasion in buffalo robes and jewelry made of porcupine quills and feathers. 4 Yankton musicians played as the chiefs assembled for the meeting. After the soldiers' military display, the Yanktons staged their own display of skill and strength. They organized a competition to show off their boys' ability to shoot with bows and arrows. That evening, assembled around 3 campfires, the Indians told stories in song to the music of the drums and rattles. The singers acted out great deeds and battles. Each singer, his skin painted with vivid colors, leaped and swirled to make his story come alive. The explorers loved the entertainment. To show their pleasure, they threw gifts to the performers: bells, small pouches of tobacco, a few knives. Even the captains were impressed with the Yanktons and thought them handsome and well-dressed. Unlike the men, Seaman did not relax during the party. He was nervous around so many strangers, their unfamiliar smells, movements, and sounds. He padded restlessly around the merry camp, his ears alert and his eyes watching closely. He never growled at the Yanktons, but he avoided their touch. He settled down beside Lewis for a few minutes, then moved to sit near Clark or Coulter or another of the men. While the braves danced, Seaman wandered over to York and sat down. The Indians were especially interested in York because of his dark skin. They swirled close to him, inviting him to join their dance. York laughed and clapped his hands to the music. At one point, he leaped up and danced a short jig. He tried to draw Seaman into the fun, but the dog sat stiffly and wouldn't play. The next morning, another formal meeting was held with the Indians. This time, the Yankton chiefs made their speeches. The captains gave out gifts of tobacco, but the Indians were not pleased with either tobacco or medals. They wanted practical gifts such as guns and ammunition, and they said so. Although the Yanktons were openly disappointed with the generosity of their new white father, the Corps could not afford to give away vital supplies. They had a long journey ahead of them. All in all, both groups parted with mixed feelings. The meeting had been friendly and enjoyable, but not completely satisfying. Soon after the explorers said goodbye to the Yanktons, they realized that one of their men was missing. George Shannon had not returned from a hunting trip. Nobody had any reason to think young Shannon would desert. The captains were sorely worried. The evening campfires did not seem so cozy without Shannon's song. Seaman roamed restlessly about the camp. On August 30th, the captain sent John Coulter, an excellent tracker, to find Shannon. What had happened to the youngest man in the Corps of Discovery? Had he been captured by the Sioux? As the explorers paddled and pulled their boats upstream, they were constantly looking out for Shannon. They kept up with Coulter's progress by noting the muddy tracks he left alongside the river. The men also watched for more Indians. On the 7th of September, Lewis whistled for Seaman. He and Clark were eager to inspect the countryside. The look of the land had been changing gradually as the Missouri River left the Great Plains and moved into the northern plains. The captains walked along the river and gazed through the trees at the rolling prairie. Seaman picked up the scent of fresh deer droppings. A herd of elk was just visible in the distance. Clark spotted ripe yellow plums growing on small trees, and the captain stopped to feast on the soft, delicious fruit. Seaman wandered onto the grassy prairie and noticed a small squirrel standing on its hind legs. He sprang toward it, but the squirrel seemed to vanish. Seaman twirled, looking for the quick-footed creature. It popped up a few yards away and chattered in a thin, squeaky voice. The seaman darted after it, but it disappeared again. Then, as if by magic, it popped up a few yards to the right. This time Seaman hesitated. The little squirrel watched him. Suddenly, a second one popped up, its beady eyes alert. Then a third stood up and made a whistling squeak. Seaman turned round and round, watching in confusion as the little creatures popped up all around him. The captains caught up, intrigued that Seaman seemed to be dancing. Lewis called, and Seaman came slowly, glancing behind him at the odd little creatures that were standing and watching him. Lewis stroked Seaman's big head. "It's all right, boy," he said, grinning. "These animals are not like the squirrels back at home. They seem to have escape tunnels, and they slip into their holes before you can pounce on them." Clark dropped to his knees to examine one of the holes. "I wonder how far down this tunnel goes. I can't see any sign of the creature hiding in here." He stood up and shaded his eyes with his hands to see how far the collection of holes extended. Hundreds of holes stretched out over an area larger than the grounds of Camp Wood. "Quite an army of these little creatures out here, I'd say. I'd like to capture one of these animals and send it home to our scientists," said Lewis. "I've never seen a squirrel that makes tunnels like these. I'm going to get the men. We'll dig into one of these tunnels right now." Lewis came back, bringing shovels and a pole, as well as most of the men. They dug 6 feet through hard clay following one tunnel, but didn't reach the animal. When the diggers paused to wipe sweat off their foreheads, York stuck the pole into the hole. "Look," he said, "this here hole goes farther than the length of this pole. We've dug as deep as a proper grave, but we haven't even dug halfway to the end of this tunnel." Lewis ordered the men to stop digging. "No use digging up half the prairie," he snapped in frustration. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to think of another way to capture one of the squirrels. "Seems we're not having any better luck than Seaman," Clark said cheerfully. "What do you say we give it up, Merriweather? We can just write a description in our field notes." But Lewis was determined to capture one of the creatures. He sent the men back to the river to fetch a barrel of water. They poured the water into the tunnel, expecting to wash the animal out. That didn't work, and Clark was for giving up again. But Lewis refused to budge without his prey, so he sent the men back for another barrel of water. It took 5 barrels of water before one of the creatures was finally forced to the surface and captured. When they got back to camp, Lewis put the little creature in a cage in the keelboat's cabin. Some of the men said these little squirrels were called the small dogs of the prairie by French-speaking trappers. But the scientists in the United States had never heard of prairie dogs, so Lewis carefully described them in his notes. Lewis decided to join the hunting parties to get a better feel for the animal life of the northern plains. He shot his first buffalo on September 8th. The next day, Lewis and another man went hunting. Seaman ran through the brush next to them. As they came to a bend in the river, Seaman raised his head and sniffed. The smell of matted buffalo fur and sweat was new to him. As the huge animals moved, they broke the earth with their hoofs, overturning clods of grass and filling the air with the smell of fresh dirt. Seaman pranced around Lewis's legs, woofing with excitement. Lewis motioned to Seaman to stay behind. The men crept through the brush, approaching downwind of the herd so they could get close before the buffalo smelled them and stampeded. When the hunters broke into the clearing, Lewis shouted, "Get 'em, Seaman!" Seaman bounded after the heels of the galloping animals as the men took aim and fired. Lewis and the other hunters each shot a buffalo that day. Seaman ran and chased until he was exhausted. As the men quartered the meat and tied it to poles so they could haul it back to camp, Seaman stretched out on the ground panting. Pleased with his success as a hunter, Lewis was in a playful mood. He picked up a long stick and urged Seaman to grab hold on one end for the game of tug-of-war. Seaman ignored the stick and rolled over, sprawling like a tired puppy. Lewis scratched the dog's belly. "We've had a fine day hunting, haven't we, boy?" he said, laughing out loud. Coulter never managed to track down Shannon, but on September 11th, the mystery of the missing man was finally solved. As the keelboat rounded a bend, Seaman began to bark excitedly. The men looked puzzled. They had never heard Seaman make the sound. It was higher and louder, more instant than his everyday barking. Suddenly, one of the men shouted, "God be praised! There's George Shannon!" The keelboat pulled up to the bank, and the men surrounded Shannon. The young man seemed astonished to see the boats. He had assumed the Corps had traveled far ahead of him and had given up trying to follow. He had lost one of the 2 horses he had taken with him. His bullets had run out 12 days before, so he had been eating mostly fruit. His only hope was to meet some trappers who might take him back to a settlement. Shannon was very thin and weak. The men helped him aboard the keelboat, and Seaman jumped in beside him. Shannon sat down, put his arm around the dog's thick neck, and leaned against him for support. Seaman sat very still, examining the young man's weary face. The men handed Shannon some dried meat, and he ate it gratefully as he told his story. Then he rested his head on Seaman's thick fur and fell sound asleep, sitting up. Seaman did not so much as shift his weight until Shannon awoke. They proceeded on. Over the next few days, Clark killed an antelope, and Lewis weighed and measured it, recording another new animal in his field notes. One of the men killed a jackrabbit, and again Lewis described a new type of animal. They continued to see vast herds of buffalo. Lewis reported seeing 3,000 animals in one herd. The next encounter with the Sioux started out much the same as the meeting with the Yankatons. On September 23rd, 3 teenagers swam up to camp. These boys were Teton Sioux, another tribe in the mighty Sioux Nation. The captains made signs for the boys to arrange a meeting with their chiefs. The next day, however, the expedition's relations with the Indians turned sour. John Coulter returned from a hunting trip with some freshly killed game tied to his horse. While some of the men were helping to load the meat onto a pirogue, a band of Indians stole the horse. Coulter shouted for help, and there was an argument between the men and the Indians. The following morning, 3 Teton chiefs and a group of warriors arrived in camp. They brought buffalo meat as a gift for the white men. The captains gave the Indians some smoked pork in return. Then a formal meeting began. Lewis gave his usual speech about the new white father and the benefits of becoming a trading family. But he soon saw something was wrong. His words were not making a good impression. In fact, the Teton Sioux could not understand anything he was saying. None of the men in the Corps, not even those who had been trappers, could speak the Tetons' language, so nobody could translate Lewis's speech. As soon as he realized what the problem was, Lewis ended his speech and gave out some medals and other small gifts. Seaman stood stiff-legged watching the Teton Indians. Unlike the Ottos and the Yankatons, the Teton Sioux did not seem friendly. Instead of sitting quietly while Lewis spoke, the Teton chiefs turned to each other and spoke in loud voices. They gestured with clenched fists and sharp jabbing movements. Unable to sit still, Seaman edged closer to Lewis. Finally, he positioned himself between the Indians and the captain. The gifts did not improve the mood of the Teton visitors. They scowled, and their voices became louder. Clearly, they thought they should receive more and better presents. Clark strode up to Lewis and whispered something. Lewis nodded and motioned for the 3 chiefs to follow him aboard one of the pirogues. Clark and several men got aboard, and Seaman hopped on board beside Clark. The men rowed out to the keelboat, and the captains and their guests and Seaman jumped aboard the large boat.